Shalom and welcome to Shikul Da'at. I'm Rabbi Josh Rose. This week's Torah portion is Vayakel, and it is a turning point in the Torah. Up until this point, for the last several parshiot, we have been learning about the instructions for the construction of the tabernacle. That is, God has been conveying to Moses all of the parts of the Mishkan, all of the clothing of the priests, and the offerings that should happen for the inauguration. But in this Torah portion, beginning in this Torah portion, Moses begins to convey to the Israelites those instructions. So it marks a critical turning point. And we notice that when we begin reading the Torah portion, in the first verse, there's a discussion of the preparation to construct the Mishkan. It says, "Vayakel Moshe et kol adat bnei Yisrael." Moses then gathered the whole Israelite community and said to them, "These are the things that God has commanded you to do." And we might think that Moses is about to begin the description of how the sanctuary or the Mishkan is to be created. But then it begins, the next verse, "On 6 days work may be done, but in the seventh day you shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, holy to God. Whoever does any work on it shall be put to death." So what seemed like was going to be the beginning of the description of the Mishkan then turns into a description of the limitations of Shabbat. Our rabbis derive from this that the 39 av malachot, that is, the categories of prohibited labor of malacha, derive from this. That is why these two parts are adjacent. So I will return to that later. But I want to look right now at a larger picture, which is to use the framework that Abraham Joshua Heschel lays out in his magnificent book, The Sabbath, Its Meaning for Modern Man, in which he contrasts the holiness in space, that is the Mishkan, to the holiness in time, which is a feature of Shabbat. And I want to start with the idea that Shabbat trumps the Mishkan. That is, for the rabbis who created the laws of Shabbat in the Talmud, or I should say derived the laws of Shabbat in the Talmud, they took from the adjacency of Shabbat and this description of the sanctuary the idea that these are the acts that are prohibited on Shabbat. That which is required for the Mishkan is prohibited on Shabbat, which is to say, to use the framework of Abraham Joshua Heschel, that the sanctification of space is subject to the sanctification of time. I want to explore this by looking at another moment in which the people Israel celebrate the work of their hands. Last week, we talked about the golden calf. And it says when that episode begins, "Vayar ha'am ki voshesh Moshe leredet minahar v'yikahel ha'am al Aharon vayomru elav kum aseh lanu Elohim asher yelchu lifnenu ki zeh Moshe ha'ish asher ha'elanu me'eretz Mitzrayim lo yadanu mahayalo." When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, the people gathered against Aaron, vayikahel ha'am al Haron, and said to him, "Come, make us a god who shall go before us. For that man Moses, who brought us from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has happened to him." If you're a careful Hebrew reader, you'll notice something interesting. This week's Torah portion begins with the verb vayakel, the same verb that describes the Israelites gathering around Aaron in last week's Torah portion, demanding the creation of a golden calf. The parallel is hard to miss. I mean, in both cases, the Israelites give valuables to a leader in order to facilitate the presence of a divine being. And the creation of that thing is preceded in both cases by this verb, vayakel, vayikahel, that signifies the coming together of the people. That verb is the same root as the verb kihila, which we use to mean community. In case that weren't enough, there's also the fact that the people eat and drink, which is exactly what Moses and Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, and the 70 elders of Israel do when they have a vision of God way back in chapter 24 of Exodus after receiving all of the laws in Parshat Mishpatim. So it does seem like the Torah wants us to notice the resonances between the golden calf story and these other, for want of a better term, God-authorized encounters. But why? Why is the Torah drawing our attention to these parallels? Well, one lesson that I've spoken about previously and alluded to in last week's podcast is the idea that there is a constant danger of reducing Torah and even God, or rather our conception of God, into a kind of idol. There's a razor-thin line between authentic religious expression and idolatry. Human beings have an inclination to rally together to get things done. That's something we have in common with every other species. Vayakel. We become a community. But community is not a good in and of itself. People come together for evil as well as good. So I want to return to the golden calf story to try to understand it and maybe shed some light on our Torah portion. So going back to the golden calf, why did they join together? Well, they decided that whatever they wanted ought to be created. The golden calf is not some shameful episode isolated in the ancient Jewish past. It is an eternal product of human longing constructed from the belief that our desires should be fulfilled because they are our desires. The Egel HaZahav, that is the golden calf, is an expression, therefore, of nihilism. It doesn't stand for anything beyond itself. It doesn't point to some larger value. Of course, the Israelites imagine that it does. After all, they say, "This is your God Israel that brought you out of Egypt." But how could that be true? They've just made this thing from their own jewelry. And yet, we do this too. Sometimes we worship our own egos, orienting our entire lives around the fulfillment of our desires. And we are no strangers either to dressing up that desire in the costume of self-justifying narratives, pretending that we're aspiring to some larger purpose when actually we're simply satisfying our own egos. So all of these things we do as individuals, and they can kill us spiritually. But the golden calf story is a story about a mob, and the nihilistic impulse within the individual gains momentum, power, and violence whenever the mob gathers. Political slogans and mob chants, and in our own day memes, or what have you, sometimes serve the need to cover up these ugly impulses in some story of greatness and meaning. This is your God, Israel, that brought you out of Egypt. Now, let's look at what motivates the Israelites to create this idol. It's fear and confusion. After 40 days of waiting, they despair. "This man Moses," they say, "we don't know what became of him." When we're afraid and unsure, we reach out for an answer that will quickly alleviate the pain of not knowing. Worshipping the work of their own hands, they begin to eat and drink. I want to use this moment in the golden calf story to turn and make a comparison to authentic religious expression. Before this eating and drinking to celebrate the calf, we see a nearly identical moment many chapters earlier, as I mentioned a moment ago. Moses, Aaron, his sons, and the elders do that same thing at Mount Sinai. But what precedes that celebration? Well, it's a list of 53 laws outlining ethical and religious obligations that are part of the covenant with God. There could not be a more stark contrast. With the golden calf, the Israelites are unchained, free to follow their own desires. They do so by creating material object around which they can rally. At Mount Sinai, they are bound by ethical and religious limits on those desires. Bound not by a physical representation, but by words, ethereal expressions of ideas that are larger than themselves. This, I think, is the core difference between idolatry and religious expression. Idolatry is nihilistic because it is oriented towards self-satisfaction and is not bound by anything larger than ourselves. True avodah, holy service, has us confront the very limits of our humanity. These limits are ontological, that is, they acknowledge the very limits of our humanness in a world created by the infinite, and they are ethical. They acknowledge the limits of our egos in a world in which we have to see our moral obligations to other people. With this in mind, then, let's go back to the very first verse of this week's Torah portion. Vayakel Moshe et kol adat b'nei Yisrael, vayomer elehem ele hadavarim asher tziva Adonai la'asot otam. Moses then gathered the whole Israelite community and said to them, "These are the things that Hashem has commanded you to do." This Vayakel, this gathering, is one that emerges from a divine command, not from the desires of the Israelites. And now, Moshe, having received all of the instructions for the creation of the sanctuary, is just about to relay those to the Israelites so that the work can commence. But instead of that which we might expect, instead we get Sheshet Yamim Ta'aseh Malacha Uvyom HaShvi'i Yeh Lechem Kodesh Shabbat Shabbaton L'Adonai Kol Ha'oseh Vo Malacha Yumat. On 6 days work may be done, but on the 7th day ye shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, holy to God. Whoever does any work on it shall be put to death. So set aside for a moment that in the Talmud the rabbis rendered the death penalty essentially non-existent. But to return, why a discussion of this principle of Shabbat here? Well, practically, the rabbis derive from the adjacency of the sanctuary description and Shabbat what are the foundations of the limits of Shabbat. That is, whatever was required for the construction of the sanctuary is precisely what is prohibited on Shabbat. But we might understand the larger significance to be connected to our discussion about idolatry. We might think that the work of the sanctuary is so great, so important, that we should do it whenever we please. But Shabbat comes to put a limit even on the holiest work that people might do. Lest we become so entranced with our own notion of what is holy in the physical realm, that is, the holiness of space to which we can contribute, Shabbat is an assertion of the holiness of time. In this we can participate, but we cannot add to or diminish it. And so we confront a limit, an all-important limit on our own egos, our own yearnings, even when we think they are for the highest purpose. And this acceptance of limits that originate from a source other than us, this is what keeps us from ultimately worshiping ourselves. The holiness of time trumps the holiness of space. I mentioned earlier that Abraham Joshua Heschel writes about this idea. And in discussing the absence from the creation story of any discussion of holy space, he writes, "This is a radical departure from accustomed religious thinking. The mythical mind would expect that after heaven and earth have been established, God would create a holy place, a holy mountain or a holy spring, whereupon a sanctuary is to be established. Yet it seems as if to the Bible it is holiness in time, the Sabbath, which comes first." He goes on, "When history began, there was only one holiness in the world, holiness in time. When at Sinai the word of God was about to be voiced, a call for holiness in man was proclaimed. Thou shalt be unto me a holy people. It was only after the people had succumbed to the temptation of worshiping a thing, a golden calf, that the erection of a tabernacle of holiness in space was commanded. The sanctity of time came first, the sanctity of man came second, and the sanctity of space last. Time was hallowed by God. Space, the tabernacle, was consecrated by Moses." Thus, these opening verses from our Torah portion can be used to understand the great principle of a life of mitzvah. To the one unfamiliar with the demands of a life of Torah, all of these rules and limits appear to diminish human life and to constrain our freedom. But the contrast between the Mishkan and Shabbat in our Parsha offers a window into the Torah's understanding of the human condition. It is the nihilistic impulse within us that poses the greatest danger to us. Unchecked human aspiration and longing ultimately traps us in the prison of self, an empty, howling wasteland devoid of meaning and purpose. But the world in which we can orient our lives to a larger purpose and meaning, in which our own egos are held in check by a greater principle, that is the source of true freedom. Shabbat Shalom. Thanks for listening.